February 22nd, 1842, Georgia, Mardi Gras night. Not the kind with brass bands and dancing in New Orleans. Not the kind with beads and music spilling through streets. This Mardi Gras was the quietest kind, the one that smelled of smoke, iron, and fear. The wind rattled the shutters of the big house, carrying with it the whispers of the cane fields, cold, damp. And under it all, the sound of chains dragging along wooden floors, the sound of someone waiting. David. That was the name of the slave who walked barefoot across the frozen earth. David, 23 years old, tall, shoulders narrow but strong, hands cracked and bleeding from the daily grind. David, eyes dark as soil, as deep as roots buried under centuries of oppression. His back bore stripes of shame, the names of overseers carved into flesh, names he would never forget. William Clay, Thomas Reddick, Samuel Hunt, names that tasted of fire in his mouth, names that sank into his belly. He was trained to obey. He was trained to bend, to bow, to break. But David did not bend. He did not bow. He would not break. The axe he held was supposed to chop wood, fuel the fire, cut through winter. But the axe was not for wood. It was for reckoning. The plantation smelled like molasses and rot, like iron and sweat. The air hung heavy, sticky with the scent of fermented sugar. The cane fields stretched into mist, endless green and brown, hiding shadows, hiding secrets. Women bent over the soil, backs curved like question marks, faces blank, hands raw. Children carried water, carrying the weight of hunger in their bones. And the overseer's horse stamped the earth, iron shoes ringing, announcing terror before it came. David walked through the morning like a ghost. His feet had learned the rhythm of mud, the sting of stone. He remembered every crack in the floorboards of the quarters, every cold night when he shivered under a thin blanket, every lash that tore his flesh and tested his resolve. Every detail of humiliation was burned into his memory, every injustice carved into his being. The big house loomed at the edge of the field, whitewashed, proud, untouchable, windows glowing with oil lamps, casting squares of light onto the ground. From there, the smell of roasting meat floated down, taunting the quarters where slaves gnawed at bones stripped bare. David tasted salt and ash in his mouth each night, not from food but from fury. They called it discipline, but it was torture. They called it work, but it was slavery. They called him boy, but he was a man. Mardi Gras arrived. Georgia did not dress in masks or beads. Still, the masters drank, laughed, flaunted wealth and power. William Clay's chuckle was a blade, Thomas Reddick's grin a whip, Samuel Hunt's gaze like ice in David's back. They had no parades. They had no joy, only the cruelty that had always defined them. And in the quarters, David sat by a fire that flickered like memory itself, sharpening the axe meant for wood. His reflection danced on the blade. His silence grew heavier. Every day on the plantation was a drumbeat. Every command barked, every lash struck, every step measured. David moved in rhythm with it, silent, observant. He learned the cadence of cruelty. He knew the footsteps of William Clay, the shift of Thomas Reddick's weight, the exact angle of Samuel Hunt's swing when he lashed. He remembered it all. Every moment, every sound, every smell, every name. David's life had been mapped for him. Rise before dawn, cut cane until noon, wash floors until dusk, sleep on straw until midnight. Food was a rationed memory. Corn mush, scraps of pork, bitter tea. Water cold enough to sting lips, mud mixed with ice, dogs barking at the edges. The quarters had never been so cold. The sky had never been so grey. And in the grey and the cold, David's fire grew. There were others in the quarters, men and women, some younger than him, some older, but all weighed down by the same chains. Sarah, Mary, Elijah. Names repeated like drums in his mind, friends, lovers, family stolen by disease, by sale, by death, all gone. And in their absence, a promise formed. The promise that one day someone would answer the wrongs. Someone would balance the scales. David watched the masters closely, observed their habits, memorized the patterns. Not because he feared them, not because he hated them, though he did, but because he waited. Waited for the moment when silence would be more powerful than screams, when patience would turn to action, when an axe could become a voice. He was underestimated, always underestimated, the quiet one in the corner, the one who nodded when spoken to, the one who carried loads without complaint, who whispered little, who laughed less. They called him obedient, they called him compliant, they called him a boy, but David remembered. He remembered every sound, the crack of a whip, the slap of leather on skin, the laughter that followed. He remembered every smell, sweat, blood, smoke, molasses, rot, the sharp tang of fear. He remembered every touch, iron chains, coarse blankets, the sting of rope, the heat of the fire that he was never allowed to warm by. And most of all, he remembered every name, William Clay, Thomas Reddick, Samuel Hunt. Every name a drumbeat in the night, every name a promise of reckoning. The quarters at night smelled of smoke and sorrow. David lay awake on his straw, the axe by his side, listening for the steps that could betray the unwary, listening for the silence that would mark opportunity. The fire crackled. The wind moaned through cracks in the walls. And David waited, patient as the cane fields, patient as the seasons, patient as the earth itself. Every day he carved space in his mind for what must come. Every day he practiced control, studied angles, imagined movement. The axe was heavy in his hand, a familiar weight, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. It wasn't for cutting logs. It wasn't for warmth. It was for justice. He remembered the stories of rebellion whispered in secret, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, names that burned brighter than candles in the night. Stories of courage, stories of fury, stories of men who refused to bend. David absorbed them like fire in his chest, not because he wanted glory, not because he craved fame, because the world had taken everything from him, and it was time to take back something, even if it was only a moment, even if it was only his own voice made steel. The night thickened. Shadows pooled in corners. The wind shifted. Somewhere dogs barked. Somewhere a horse neighed. Somewhere the laughter of masters echoed faintly across the fields, unaware that their quietest slave was waiting, watching, learning, planning. And David, barefoot, broken, human, alive, held the axe close, felt the wood and iron against his palms, felt the weight settle into the rhythm of his heartbeat, felt the fire grow, felt the silence answer back. This was only the beginning. The setup, the quiet before the storm. The world had no idea what would happen when David's patience ran out, when the axe spoke for the first time, when every name whispered in pain became a drumbeat in vengeance. Because David remembered. Every detail, every face, every lash, every stolen meal, every insult, every stolen loved one, every cruel smile. He remembered. And he would not forget. The sun would rise tomorrow, but tonight the shadows belonged to David, and the fire in him would not sleep. David's past was stitched with fire and shadow. Georgia, 1820s. He was a boy then, not more than 8, with hands too small to hold a hoe and eyes too large for the world he was born into. The quarter smelled of smoke and sweat, of rotting vegetables and wet straw. The wind carried the scent of pine and the distant fields, the sound of axes and whips, and the endless murmur of sorrow. His mother, Ruth, a quiet woman with skin like dark chocolate and eyes like storm clouds, whispered stories in the evening. Stories of ancestors stolen from Africa, of kings and warriors, of freedom that had been snatched from their hands before they even knew its taste. Ruth sang songs low, so low the masters could not hear, songs that smelled like fire and earth and salt. David remembered her voice, remembered the weight of her hands on his back, trying to shield him from the lash, from the world. She was a mother, a protector, a memory he would cling to. And his father, Amos, had been strong once. A man who carried logs twice the size of David, who could wrestle an ox with his bare hands. But the masters broke him slowly, methodically, like iron softening in a blacksmith's fire. They took him away when David was 10, sold him to another plantation 3 counties over. David remembered the day they dragged his father from the field. The way Amos's eyes lingered on him, a warning, a blessing, a farewell. David remembered the smell of sweat, the sting of tears in his own eyes, the howl of dogs chasing a freedom they could never reach. By the time he was 12, David had lost almost everything. Friends sold, families torn apart, childhood stolen by the fields. He carried memories like stones in his pockets, heavy and cold. The lashes on his back were constant reminders, the overseer's shouts a drumbeat of pain. Every day he counted the hours until sunset, counted the names of those who had hurt him, those who had laughed at his suffering: William Clay, Thomas Reddick, Samuel Hunt. Names repeated like chants in his mind, names that burned hotter than the sun. There was a promise once, a cruelly broken promise. The master's son, Edward Hunt, had said to him one day, "You work hard, boy, and maybe you'll live without fear." David had believed it for a moment, that fragile breath of hope. But the promise was a lie. The next week, a cane snapped across his back for failing to carry water fast enough. The next month, he watched his friend Elijah beaten to death for spilling a basket of corn. David remembered Elijah's eyes wide and terrified. His last breath carried in a scream that echoed for years in David's mind. Every injury, every loss, every lie was stored. Every memory sharpened into a blade. He remembered the winter when the river froze, and he was forced to carry ice water barefoot across the field. Skin splitting, lips blue, teeth chattering, while the masters laughed from the warm house. He remembered Mary, his sister, 12 years old, sold to another plantation. He remembered Sarah, his first love, taken by disease after being forced to work sick, coughing blood into the mud. Every name, every face, every loss piled into him like logs on a fire, until he felt nothing but the heat and the waiting. David's wounds were not only physical, they were the betrayal of trust, the theft of childhood, the constant hum of humiliation. He learned early that silence was power, that observation was survival, that patience was the only weapon a boy could wield against men who wielded whips and fear like swords. He remembered every glance, every sneer, every word spoken in malice. And he remembered the small victories too, hiding food, carrying water carefully, helping younger children without alerting the overseers. Each minor triumph fed the ember inside him, each act of defiance a spark. At 14, he witnessed his first public execution of a fellow slave for trying to escape. The man, Joseph, was tall like David, strong and brave, but the chains and ropes could not be broken. They hanged him from the oak in the center of the plantation, and David stood among the others, forced to watch, forced to breathe the cold wind and the scent of rope and blood. Joseph's last words were swallowed by the wind, but David remembered the look in his eyes: fury, fear, unbroken spirit. That look would visit him in dreams for years, a ghost that would whisper vengeance. The quarter itself bore the memory of pain: straw mats soaked in rain, floors that smelled of urine and rot, walls thin enough for whispers to travel but thick enough to hide screams. He learned to move quietly, to listen, to wait. The world of the masters was a theater of cruelty, and he was its silent observer. David's ears became sharp, his eyes sharper. Every step of William Clay, the tilt of Thomas Reddick's hat, the way Samuel Hunt's fingers twitched before striking, they were notes in a symphony of oppression, and David could read it all. Food was a weapon too: corn mush, scraps of pork, bitter tea, meals given sparingly, always with contempt. Hunger was another lash, another reminder of their control. David learned to taste the difference between survival and starvation, between giving in and holding on. He remembered stealing a small piece of bread for a younger child once, hiding it in the folds of his shirt while overseers barked commands. That day, the taste of flour and crumbs was sweeter than any meat in the big house. That day, he felt the smallest flicker of what would later become courage. But loss never stopped. Death, separation, disease, it was all around him. The fire of grief stoked in his chest, relentless, unyielding. He remembered every funeral, every face wrapped in cloth, every candle flickering in the wind. And he remembered the whispers of others. One day we'll rise. One day the chains will break. He clung to that whisper like water to stone, like blood to wound, like the axe he would one day lift. David's mind became a ledger of wrongs. Every lash, every insult, every stolen moment of childhood noted. He began to catalogue the master's cruelty in ways only he could understand. Patterns, times, angles, the way William Clay's boot struck the ground when he was about to shout. The way Thomas Reddick's hand rested on the cane before swinging. The angle of Samuel Hunt's shadow at dusk. He remembered all these things. Not to surrender, not to forget, but to prepare, to wait, to sharpen not only the blade in his hand, but the steel inside his soul. He learned the lesson early: memory was power. Every moment of suffering was a seed, and seeds grow when watered with patience, with hate, with longing. Every friend lost, every promise broken, every loved one taken away, every cruel laugh, every unjust lash, all of it was fuel. David would not forget. He would not forgive. He would wait. The past was heavy. The past was sharp. The past was fire in his chest and ice in his bones. He carried Ruth's voice, Amos's gaze, Elijah's scream, Mary's tears, Sarah's cough. He carried them all. Every name was repeated in his mind, every loss, every grief, every injustice. They were logs stacked for a fire that would one day roar unstoppable, consuming. And so he waited. He worked, he endured, he learned, and he remembered. Not because it was safe, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Every detail mattered. Every step mattered. Every sound, smell, shadow mattered. The past had carved him into something else. Patient, observant, quiet, unassuming, but burning with a heat no lash could cool. That fire would not die. David's past wounds were deep. Every scar, every loss, every stolen dream was another strike of the hammer shaping the blade he would one day lift. And when that day came, the past would not whisper. It would roar. David's patience became a quiet storm. The days blurred together in the cane fields, yet every step he took was measured, every gesture calculated. He moved like a shadow, blending with the tall stalks, listening for the soft footfalls of William Clay on the veranda, listening for the shift in Thomas Reddick's voice before a command, listening for the subtle click of Samuel Hunt's belt buckle, the prelude to a lash. Every sound became a thread in a tapestry only he could read, and he read it all. By 16, David had mastered the art of invisibility, not because he was weak, not because he feared, but because he understood power in patience. The masters never noticed the corners he avoided, the stolen glances at hidden caches of tools, the whispered exchanges with those who had also learned silence. Sarah's face would appear in his mind, a memory sharpened by grief, and he would remember her cough, the red-stained sheets where she had lain, the way she had smiled even in pain. He remembered Mary, the stolen sister, and her gentle hands brushing away mud from a baby's face. Every face stolen from him became a reason to endure, a reason to watch, a reason to wait. Small acts of rebellion began quietly. A spilled bucket of water left unnoticed, a crooked line in the furrows of the cane, a fire that flared too high for the overseer to reach. Nothing overt, nothing traceable, yet each act was a whisper of defiance, a test of boundaries, a seed planted in the rich soil of resentment. David learned to move with purpose behind the quiet, each action deliberate, each inaction equally deliberate. He remembered the taste of stolen corn, the warmth of a hidden ember, the soft murmur of allies' voices in the dead of night. Observation became his weapon. He memorized routines, the exact hour William Clay checked the stables, the minute Thomas Reddick retreated to the veranda, the time Samuel Hunt left the quarters for his personal amusements. He catalogued weaknesses in the guards, the habits of the hounds, the vulnerabilities of the plantation itself, and he remembered every name associated with cruelty. They were not just masters. They were a network of oppression, a lattice of flesh and authority, and David catalogued each thread like a surgeon tracing veins before the cut. Every night, he dreamed not of escape, not of fleeing, but of justice. He imagined the axe cutting through more than wood, cutting through chains, through lies, through years of stolen life. The weight of it in his hands became familiar, comforting. He sharpened the blade in secret, the metallic whisper slicing through the silence of the quarters like a promise. David remembered Ruth's voice warning him of danger. He remembered Amos's eyes instructing him to be patient. And he remembered Elijah, Joseph, Mary, Sarah, all names repeating, echoing, embedding themselves in his mind like drums summoning a march. Rebellion grew in tiny bursts. A stolen potato from the garden, a hidden scrap of cloth to mend torn clothing. A whispered plan with Sarah or Mary when overseers were distracted. Each act a test of courage, each act a rehearsal for what must come. The small victories were intoxicating. They reminded him of his own strength, of the fire inside, the ember that could not die. And David learned more than observation. He learned manipulation. He learned to bend the perception of his masters without breaking his resolve, to nod and smile, to bow and obey, to appear weaker than he was, while the steel of his mind sharpened in secret. William Clay called him obedient. Thomas Reddick called him harmless. Samuel Hunt called him boy, and David remembered. Every word a hammer stroke against chains. Every underestimation a gift. The fire within him was not rage alone. It was methodical. It was careful. It was patient as the river that ran behind the plantation, cold, steady, unstoppable. He memorized the night sky, the patterns of the wind, the way moonlight touched the porch, the soft echo of his own footsteps on the veranda boards. Every detail could be a tool, every shadow a shield, every silence a weapon. Allies were few but important. He watched others in the quarters, their small acts of defiance, their quiet endurance. Sarah taught him subtle communication, a look, a nod, a shared glance that carried meaning. Mary showed him courage in caring for children, in protecting the weak. And every ally, every whispered confidence, every secret meeting at midnight built the network of resolve that would later become unstoppable. David's mind became a laboratory of revenge. He experimented with angles, with timing, with patience. He calculated the time it took William Clay to cross the veranda, the number of steps Thomas Reddick took between fields, the precise moment Samuel Hunt would light his pipe and drift into carelessness. Every routine became a tool. Every tool became a weapon. And all the while he remembered Ruth, Amos, Elijah, Joseph, Mary, Sarah, names repeating in his mind, echoing like a drumbeat to which his heart marched. It was in these years that he learned one of the most important truths. Patience is not surrender. Observation is not submission. Silence is not weakness. It is preparation. It is the soil from which revolution can grow. And David planted seeds of rebellion in that soil, nurturing them with the memory of injustice, the heat of anger, and the cold calculation of a mind sharpened by suffering. David's body remained under the master's control, but his spirit began to detach, to operate in parallel, free and untouchable. His eyes, dark and watchful, missed nothing. His hands, scarred and calloused, held instruments with new purpose. His back bore stripes like a ledger of cruelty, but his mind carried plans like a fortress. Every morning he walked the cane fields with a ghostly presence, unnoticed yet formidable. Every evening he returned to the quarters with the axe, the dreams, the fire burning brighter than ever. And he learned to dream in action. Not wild, reckless dreams, but disciplined visions. Every swing of the axe, every movement, every calculated strike was imagined over and over, until the pattern was seamless, until the timing was perfect. He visualized the steps, the blood, the cries, the final stillness. He imagined the eyes of his oppressors wide with disbelief. He imagined the satisfaction of justice delivered, the fulfillment of memory's promise. David began to understand that his body could obey their commands, but his mind could not. The masters owned flesh, labor, obedience, but they could not own fire. They could not own patience. They could not own memory. And the seeds of rebellion took root in that realization. They grew, slow and silent, into something unstoppable. By the time Mardi Gras approached, David had become more than a slave. He was a quiet observer, a patient planner, a shadow in the fields, a spark beneath the surface. He had rehearsed the rhythm of cruelty, catalogued every habit, memorized every weakness, and nurtured a fire no lash could extinguish. The small acts of defiance were now part of a larger design, and the axe waited, heavy and familiar, in the corner of the quarters. The rebellion was no longer just a thought. It was a plan. It was a pulse in his chest. It was a promise to every lost Ruth, every lost Amos, every Elijah, every Joseph, every Mary, every Sarah. Names repeated like drums, echoing in his mind, guiding his hand, sharpening his resolve. And when the night came, when shadows stretched long across the fields, when the masters laughed and drank and celebrated in ignorance, David's fire would no longer be quiet. The seeds of rebellion had grown, nurtured by memory, sharpened by patience, ready to burst into the reckoning that had been years in the making. The breaking point arrived like a storm in the middle of a hot Georgia afternoon. The sun scorched the cane fields, sweat dripping from foreheads, hands blistered from endless work. The wind carried dust and the stench of rotting vegetables from the quarters, and the distant laugh of William Clay rang sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. David felt it in his bones, felt the old fire flare hotter, the ember inside him leaping to flame. That day, Thomas Reddick decided to teach a lesson. Not for rebellion, not for disobedience, simply for the enjoyment of control. He chose Elijah, who had returned briefly to the plantation, weak and thin, trembling. He lashed him 10 times across the back. David watched, silent, heart hammering, every detail etched into his mind. The angle of the cane, the crack as it met flesh, the way Elijah's scream carried across the field, piercing wood, soil, and air. He remembered the names of the overseers, the masters, all of them. William Clay, Thomas Reddick, Samuel Hunt, each name a drum beat against the fire in his chest. David didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just watched. But inside something shifted. The quiet patience, the careful observation, the long-held ember of defiance, suddenly it became a blaze. He felt it snap like iron shattering. He knew that the moment for waiting had passed. The past wounds, the small rebellions, the endless humiliation, they had all led to this instant. And the axe, waiting silently in the corner of the quarters, seemed to hum with anticipation. He remembered every lesson of patience, every catalogued detail of cruelty. He remembered Ruth's voice whispering in the dark, Amos's eyes warning him of danger, Elijah's scream marking the line that had been crossed one too many times. He remembered Mary, Sarah, all names repeating in his mind, weaving a tapestry of loss and rage. The memory of every lash, every insult, every stolen loved one became fuel. That night, David moved carefully. He gathered tools not meant for violence, the axe that was supposed to split logs, a hammer from the shed, a few knives from the kitchen. Each object transformed in his mind. Each became a potential instrument of reckoning. He handled them with the precision of someone who had lived under the whip, who had memorized angles, timing, habits. The axe wasn't for wood. It was for justice. The hammer wasn't for repairs. It was for reckoning. The knives weren't for cooking. They were for punishment. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of cooking fires. Shadows stretched long across the floorboards of the quarters. Every creak of wood underfoot seemed amplified, every whisper of wind a warning. David's heart beat in rhythm with the silence. He felt each breath, each heartbeat, each tremor of anticipation. He was no longer merely a man enduring oppression. He was a hunter, observing the prey, calculating the moment, holding back nothing. He recalled the small rebellions that had marked his years, spilled water, hidden scraps, whispered confidences. They had been practice. They had been the rehearsal for this night. The quarters had been his stage, the shadows his allies, and now the act would unfold. David's transformation was complete. Patience and observation became precision and determination. Silence became strategy. Memory became weaponized. Anger, once simmering, was now steel. He no longer feared the whip, the lash, the rope, or the guns in the hands of masters. The fear had been transformed into focus, into calculation, into inevitability. He imagined the sequence. First William Clay, who drank too freely, too loudly, laughing with arrogance. Then Thomas Reddick, predictable, proud, with a cane always within reach but a body vulnerable in distraction. Samuel Hunt, the youngest, overconfident, always underestimating him. He rehearsed the movements in his mind over and over, visualizing every step, every swing, every strike. Nothing left to chance. David remembered every failure of the past as a guide. The times he had been punished, humiliated, ignored, all were lessons. Each scar was a map, each memory a strategy. And as the night deepened, he felt the fire coiling inside him, a serpent of fury ready to strike. He sharpened the axe one last time, the metallic rasp slicing through the silence like a promise. The plan was simple, yet brutal. One for every lash he had suffered. One for every stolen loved one. One for every name repeated in his mind. Ruth, Amos, Elijah, Joseph, Mary, Sarah. He would strike swiftly. He would not hesitate. He would not falter. The past had forged him into this moment, and he would not waste it. David dressed in shadows. The moon cast slivers of light across the quarters, illuminating his path. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat was measured. The night was his accomplice, the wind his messenger, the shadows his shield. He carried the axe like an extension of his own arm, like the weight of every wrong committed against him, like the promise of vengeance distilled into steel and wood. The world outside the quarters remained oblivious. William Clay drank, Thomas Reddick boasted. Samuel Hunt joked. They had no idea the storm that waited silently, patiently in the dark. They never saw it coming. They never imagined that the quiet, observant boy they had underestimated for years had been transformed into a force shaped by fire, memory, and grief. As midnight approached, the air thick with anticipation, David moved closer to the veranda. He positioned himself with care, listening to every creak, every whisper, every movement. The axe rested in his hands, not for wood, not for warmth, but for the reckoning that had been years in the making. Every step brought him closer. Every breath steadied him. Every heartbeat reinforced the inevitability. This was no longer preparation. This was the threshold, the point of no return, the moment where patience ends and action begins. David did not hesitate. He did not falter. He did not cry. He just became the sum of every wound, every injustice, every lost friend, every broken promise. And when he struck, the world would remember. The night was thick and still. Shadows pooled across the veranda and fields, a velvet black that swallowed everything but the small gleam of moonlight on the axe in David's hands. The cane rustled softly, whispering secrets only he could hear. Every step he took was deliberate, measured, precise. William Clay's laughter echoed faintly from the big house, unaware, unsuspecting, arrogant in his ignorance. David did not cry. He did not tremble. He just moved, silent as the wind, steady as the river that cut through the plantation. Every muscle in his body remembered years of endurance. Every nerve memorized pain and humiliation. Every scar marked a lesson in patience. He remembered Ruth's voice, Amos's eyes, Elijah's scream, Joseph's defiance, Mary's touch, Sarah's cough. Every name was repeated in his mind, each a drumbeat guiding his hand. One for every wrong, one for every life stolen, one for every lash endured. William Clay sat in his study, glass of rum in hand, unaware. David stepped across the veranda, boots muffled against the floorboards, the axe raised but calm. The metallic whisper of the blade sliced through the silence like a promise. And then, with a motion as swift as lightning and as inevitable as nightfall, it struck. Clay's scream was a brief, sharp note, swallowed quickly by the shadows. The first name etched into vengeance. David did not pause. He remembered every angle, every escape route, every weakness catalogued over years. He moved through the big house like a shadow, silent, unrelenting. Thomas Reddick was next, predictable, prideful, hands clutching a cane yet vulnerable in his hubris. The axe struck again. Blood bloomed like crimson fire across the polished floors. He remembered Elijah, he remembered Joseph, he remembered Mary and Sarah, and each memory lent him strength, precision, certainty. The kitchen smelled of smoke and roasted meat. Knives hung above the counter, gleaming, unused until this moment. Samuel Hunt emerged, laughing, unthinking, unaware. The axe was not for logs. It was for justice. It was for reckoning. It was for the fire in David's chest, for the years of chains, for the silence forced upon him. The strike was swift, brutal, final. Hunt's eyes widened, shock replacing arrogance as the truth of his underestimation hit. He remembered every detail, every step he had taken to prepare, every lesson from years of observation. Every whispered act of rebellion had been practice. Every stolen glance, every hidden scrap of food, every midnight planning session had led here. The axe moved not just with his hands, but with memory, with pain, with fire. David did not hesitate. The world outside was irrelevant. The quarters, the fields, the shadows, they belonged to him now. He moved with a rhythm of inevitability, each strike a punctuation mark on the ledger of cruelty. The master's wives and children, locked safely away, oblivious to the storm, would not interrupt. This was personal, precise, surgical in its execution. One for every Elijah, one for every Joseph. One for every Mary, one for every Sarah, one for every Ruth, one for every Amos, one for every stolen piece of his soul. The axe swung, the hammer fell, the knives bit. Each name, each memory, each injustice fueled the blow. The floorboards drank deeply. The walls absorbed the echoes, the air was thick with the coppery scent of blood. David remembered every lash that had marked his back, every insult, every humiliation, every stolen piece of life. They were no longer wounds, they were guides. Maps to vengeance, paths to justice. By the time the night deepened, 7 men lay fallen, the names of the living and dead converging in David's mind like a chorus of accusation and release. William Clay, Thomas Reddick, Samuel Hunt, Their cruelty ended, their arrogance extinguished. Their screams carried the weight of history, the echo of generations, the consequences long delayed but finally delivered. The fire of rage and memory burned through him, yet there was a strange clarity. This was not chaos. This was not madness. It was precision, discipline, the culmination of years of observation, endurance, planning, and quiet rebellion. David moved from room to room, ensuring nothing was left unfinished. No injustice unaddressed, no opportunity for escape for those who had tormented him. Every action was accompanied by remembrance. Every swing of the axe remembered the heat of the sun on his back in the fields. Every blow of the hammer remembered the cries of Joseph. Every strike of the knife remembered the cough of Sarah, the tears of Mary, the whispered warnings of Ruth. The past lived in the present, shaping every movement, every choice, every strike. The plantation was a tapestry of chaos, blood, fire, and shadow. The quarters smelled of sweat and fear. The big house smelled of iron and smoke. Silence fell like a curtain after each act, punctuated only by David's steady breathing. The soft whisper of his steps, the muted thud of bodies against floorboards. The world had no idea, yet every echo of the past rang clearly in his mind. He did not cry. He did not celebrate. He did not laugh. He just moved. Each act of vengeance was a statement, each strike a message carved in blood and memory. Every name repeated, every injustice avenged, every wound mirrored in the axe, the hammer, the knives. The fire of years became a torch, guiding him through shadows and silence, through the echoes of oppression, to the final moments of reckoning. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep across the Georgia horizon, the work was done. 7 men lay still, 7 names struck from the ledger of life. David paused, listening. The air smelled of iron, smoke, and wood. Silence stretched across the plantation, thick and heavy, almost tangible. The wind carried away the last echoes of laughter, leaving only the memory of justice delivered, of fire met with fire, of patience fulfilled. He stood in the center of it all, the axe in his hands, the tools of vengeance around him. His body was exhausted, every muscle burning, yet his mind was clear. He remembered every lesson of the past. He remembered every injustice, every stolen loved one, every humiliation. And he remembered the power of memory, the inevitability of consequence, the fire of survival that had guided him through every lash, every insult, every stolen day of his life. David did not run. He did not hide. He did not fear. The storm had passed, and he stood in its eye. Silence was his ally, memory his weapon, fire his guide. The plantation was still. The cane fields swayed gently in the morning breeze, the sun casting long shadows over the devastation he had wrought. The names repeated one last time in his mind. Ruth, Amos, Elijah, Joseph, Mary, Sarah. Every strike had honored them. Every action had remembered them. The world outside would soon discover what had occurred, but David knew the truth already. Justice, patient, meticulous, precise, had been delivered. The past had been avenged, and for the first time in his life, David felt the fire inside him cool slightly. Not extinguished, never extinguished, but tempered by the reality of action, by the weight of history, by the finality of his work. The shadows receded, the light crept forward, and the world was changed. One man, quiet, observant, underestimated, had rewritten the story of his own life. The reckoning was complete. The first light of dawn crept over Georgia, softening the blood-red shadows that had consumed the plantation hours before. The cane fields swayed gently as if indifferent, as if nothing had changed. But David knew better. He could feel the pulse of the earth, the heartbeat of history, the weight of vengeance just carried out. He did not run immediately. Not yet. He moved quietly through the big house, stepping over fallen bodies, letting the axe fall into the corner where it belonged. Each step was careful, precise. Every creak of the floorboard was memorized, every shadow accounted for. The world was awakening, but the quarter remained his domain for a few fleeting moments. The wind carried distant shouts. Dogs barked, hooves clattered, and somewhere, too far to see clearly, someone screamed. David didn't cry. He didn't falter. He just became the shadow, the whisper, the memory of fire and steel. The plan had never included capture, but the reality of survival demanded immediate adaptation. He melted into the cane fields, barefoot, silent, blending with the morning fog that hugged the ground like a cloak. He remembered every path through the plantation, every creek, every hollow, every ridge that could conceal him. His body ached, muscles burning from years of labor, adrenaline, and anticipation. But he was alive. And alive meant opportunity. Alive meant possibility. Alive meant continuation of memory, continuation of fire. The first pursuers appeared, William Clay's overseers, alerted too late, running with fury and confusion. Their boots struck mud, their curses carried in the humid air. But David had planned, every detail observed, every weakness catalogued. He moved faster, slipping through shadows, using the wind, using the cane, using silence as a weapon. He remembered Elijah's scream, Joseph's defiance, Mary's tears, Sarah's cough, Ruth's voice, Amos's eyes. Each name gave him speed, precision, clarity. The cane fields, once a place of endless labor, now became a labyrinth of opportunity. The mist tangled the pursuers, slowed their vision, masked his movements. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost shaped by years of patient endurance. David reached the river that bisected the plantation. Cold water lapped against his legs, biting and raw, snapping the nerves into heightened awareness. He didn't hesitate. He plunged in, letting the current sweep him downstream. The smell of wet cane, the sound of rushing water, the icy sting on his skin, they all became allies. He remembered Ruth, Amos, Elijah, Joseph, Mary, Sarah, each memory guiding him, each life stolen or lost a beacon in the fog. The hunt continued. Dogs splashed through the shallows, teeth bared, noses wet with blood and determination. Men yelled, commands shouted, voices cracking with fear and anger. David did not stop. He twisted under branches, slid through mud, and let the river carry him farther from the plantation that had been both crucible and cage. Every heartbeat was a drum of freedom, every breath a testament to survival. By midday, exhaustion began to press against him like the weight of chains he had once carried. Cuts stung, muscles burned, the cold had seeped deep. But he remembered patience. He remembered strategy. He remembered every lesson that Ruth and Amos had given him in whispers long ago. He climbed riverbanks, hid in underbrush, and waited for pursuers to falter. He became a shadow in the light, a ghost among the living. The first capture came not from the masters, but from betrayal. One of the slaves who had been too fearful, too obedient, too hungry for reward, gave away his hiding place. Shouts again, the clatter of boots, the barking of dogs. David froze, listening. Every movement calculated, every option weighed. The moment for survival was now a gamble, a test of all the years of planning and endurance. He was cornered near an old oak, roots twisted like ancient scars. Men approached, weapons drawn, faces twisted in fury and disbelief. David did not flinch. He did not cry. He did not shout. He simply stepped forward, axe ready, and struck once, quick, precise. The cry echoed through the hollow, a testament to his preparation, his patience, his fire. But the numbers were too great. Overwhelmed, he was captured. They bound him in chains heavier than any he had carried before, the cold iron biting into skin that had long since become accustomed to pain. The axe, the hammer, the knives, all confiscated. But he did not despair. He did not shout. He did not resist beyond the limits of reality. He remembered that fire, that memory, that promise, that every action had already been made, every injustice already avenged. Dragged back toward the plantation, the world seemed suspended in a surreal rhythm. The cane swayed, indifferent, the sun climbing higher, birds singing as if nothing had happened. But David remembered. Every step, every pain, every echo of vengeance had been recorded, memorized, internalized. The names repeated: Ruth, Amos, Elijah, Joseph, Mary, Sarah. Names repeated like drums, steady, unyielding, unstoppable. He was placed in a cell, small, damp, the smell of mold and sweat, mixing with the lingering scent of blood from the night before. He did not cry. He did not curse. He just waited. The fire inside remained. The memory remained. The promise remained. Outside, men whispered of what had occurred, fear and confusion spreading like wildfire across the plantation and the county beyond. Word of the events traveled faster than David's capture could contain. The story of the quiet, observant slave who had struck 7 masters in a single night became legend immediately. Fear mixed with awe. Terrifying whispers in neighboring plantations spoke of the axe, the fire, the precision, the names repeated and avenged. David's capture did not diminish the tale. It cemented it. The world could not unhear the drumbeat of vengeance, the rhythm of patience and fire transformed into action. Chains could bind the body, but they could not bind memory. They could not silence fire. David remembered everything. He remembered the pain of the past, the lessons of patience, the faces of the lost. He remembered the act of rebellion, the swing of the axe, the rhythm of justice. Every detail burned in his mind, alive as if no chain, no cell, no master could touch it. And so he waited. For the trial, for the judgment, for the next turn of fate. He did not flinch. He did not cry. He did not despair. He remembered everything. He was alive. And alive meant that the story, the fire, the memory, the vengeance, none of it could be erased. David had escaped death that night, not through luck, but through preparation, patience, and mastery of every detail. The world had seen the result. The masters were gone. The tale spread, and even in chains, David's fire was unextinguished. The capture was temporary. The impact was permanent. David's story did not end with chains. It did not end with a cell. It did not end with the whispered fear in the eyes of neighbors or the trembling voices of those who had survived. His story endured, carried in the wind, in the river, in the cane fields, in the shadows of Georgia that had witnessed both cruelty and fire. Every name he remembered, Ruth, Amos, Elijah, Joseph, Mary, Sarah, became part of a legacy written not in ink, but in action, in defiance, in memory. The news of the massacre at the plantation spread rapidly. Word of the quiet, observant slave who had struck 7 masters with precision, and fire ignited terror across the county. Plantation owners whispered his name with dread, fearful that patience and observation could give birth to vengeance at any moment. David had become a symbol, not only of revenge, but of the power of memory, of endurance, of resistance. People repeated his name in hushed tones. David, the axe-bearer, the shadow, the unstoppable force. The names of the victims, William Clay, Thomas Reddick, Samuel Hunt, were burned into history alongside his, a stark reminder of consequences long delayed but inevitable. He did not live long in freedom after capture. Chains, shackles, and the legal system of the time pressed heavily upon him. Yet even in confinement, his presence remained alive, a phantom haunting the halls, a reminder of what patience and fire could achieve. Guards spoke of his eyes, dark and knowing, observing every gesture, every lapse, every heartbeat. They whispered of the calmness with which he endured, the quiet storm that seemed ready to erupt at any moment. No lash, no insult, no isolation could extinguish the fire in his mind. Stories circulated far beyond the plantation. Travelers spoke of the night of Mardi Gras, when vengeance had been precise, merciless, unavoidable. Parents whispered the tale to their children as a warning and as a lesson. Freedom, patience, and preparation could strike even in the most impossible circumstances. The memory of David, the quiet, observant slave, became larger than life, a ghost of history that refused to fade. Historians would later recount the events with a mix of horror and awe. The details were visceral, the axe's metallic whisper, the blood staining the polished floors, the shadows dancing in the moonlight, the cries echoing across the quarters. But beyond the brutality lay a deeper truth. A man shaped by suffering, transformed by patience and observation, could assert power in a world designed to suppress him. David's story became not just a tale of vengeance, but a story of human resilience, of the unyielding force of memory and of justice delivered when the world had failed for too long. The legacy was not only in the violence, but in the symbolism of endurance. David had endured the lash, the hunger, the separation, the loss of loved ones. He had catalogued cruelty, observed patterns, waited patiently for the perfect moment. And when the moment arrived, he acted. The axe was more than a tool. It was a voice. The swing of the blade, precise and merciless, was testimony. The names he remembered became immortal. Ruth, Amos, Elijah, Joseph, Mary, Sarah. One for every loved one lost, one for every injustice endured, one for every memory preserved in the quiet of his mind. Modern reflection sees David not only as a figure of vengeance, but as a symbol of resistance against an oppressive system. His story reminds us that patience and observation are as powerful as any weapon, that memory is fire, that justice can emerge even from the deepest shadows of cruelty. The plantation in Georgia, long gone, carries his story in its soil, in its whispers, in the legacy of those who survived and passed the tale forward. The axe, the chains, the shadows, all became part of a larger narrative, one that echoes today when we speak of resistance, when we remember the humanity stripped away by slavery, when we honor those who endured unimaginable suffering and found a way to assert themselves in a world designed to suppress them. David's fire lives in memory, in story, in the repeated drumbeat of names and justice. Even as historians debated, even as records attempted to reduce the story to fact and date, the legend endured. For it was not just the act, but the accumulation of patience, of observation, of endurance, of memory that made David remarkable. He did not act in haste. He did not act blindly. He acted with precision, guided by fire and remembrance, by loss and love, by every injustice he had catalogued since childhood. The world remembers David because he remembered. He remembered every lash, every stolen life, every whispered cruelty. He remembered Ruth. He remembered Amos. He remembered Elijah, Joseph, Mary, Sarah. And in remembering, he transformed memory into action, action into legacy, legacy into story. The past was no longer a chain. It was a weapon, a guide, a torch passed down through history. If this story chills you, it is because it is proof that patience, observation, and memory can become unstoppable, that the quietest, most underestimated among us can carry the fire of justice in their hands. That one man, shaped by suffering, can leave an imprint on history that echoes far beyond his years, far beyond the plantation, far beyond the night of Mardi Gras. Remember the names, remember the fire, remember the story of David, the slave of Georgia who transformed loss, memory, and endurance into the instrument of reckoning that history has never forgotten. If this story moves you, it is because it is more than violence. It is more than revenge. It is the power of memory, of resilience, of justice, where justice seemed impossible. Subscribe and share with those who value the quiet strength of human endurance, the fire of memory, and the unwavering pursuit of justice.